The most expensive mistake an HOA can make isn't building on the wrong land. It's believing the real owner has already lost. The old manila envelope looked almost ridiculous sitting on the polished oak table in courtroom 3. Its corners were worn soft with age, the paper faded by decades of quiet survival, while across the aisle the attorneys representing Willow Creek Highlands HOA had arrived with rolling cases full of glossy exhibits, digital surveys, architectural renderings, and enough legal binders to fill an entire bookshelf. Their lead attorney smiled the way people do when they think the ending has already been written. Outside the courthouse windows, nearly 196 brand-new homes shimmered beneath the Texas afternoon sun, each rooftop reflecting years of construction, millions of dollars in investment, and countless families who believed they had purchased the American dream. Inside, nobody paid attention to the envelope resting beside my hand. They thought it was sentimental. They thought I had come here carrying memories instead of evidence. They were wrong. My name is Ethan Walker, and before this day was over, every person in that courtroom would discover that an entire subdivision had been built on land that never stopped belonging to my family. This is a fictional story inspired by the kind of property disputes people imagine when talking about power, paperwork, and patience. None of what you're about to hear actually happened, but every moment follows one simple question that kept echoing in my head for months. What would you do if someone built an entire neighborhood on land that legally belonged to you? The judge adjusted his glasses while the clerk organized another stack of exhibits. The quiet hum of the air conditioning mixed with the faint tapping of keyboards, creating the kind of calm that only exists seconds before everything changes. Across the room sat Victoria Holloway, president of the Willow Creek Highlands HOA. 53 years old, perfectly pressed cream-colored suit, pearl earrings, and the confident smile of someone who had spent the last 2 years congratulating herself. She never looked nervous. Why would she? Her neighborhood was finished. The roads had been paved. Children rode bicycles along freshly painted sidewalks. Mailboxes stood in perfect rows. Decorative trees lined every street. Sales banners still fluttered near the entrance, promising luxury living starting in the mid-six figures. Everything looked permanent. Everything looked successful. And according to nearly everyone in town, everything belonged to the HOA now. They assumed I agreed because I never interrupted the bulldozers. I never stood in front of excavators. I never shouted at construction crews. I never chained myself to fences or appeared on the evening news demanding justice. While neighbors whispered that I had surrendered, I simply watched. Every concrete truck, every foundation, every roof, every closing sale, every congratulatory ribbon-cutting ceremony. I stayed quiet so long that people eventually confused silence with defeat. Even Victoria believed it. She walked past me once during the grand opening celebration, the smell of fresh asphalt and new landscaping still hanging in the warm air, and offered the kind of polite smile reserved for people already left behind by progress. I smiled back because arguing would have accomplished nothing. There was only one place where the truth mattered, and it wasn't standing beside freshly planted flower beds beneath colorful balloons. It was here, inside this courtroom, where paper carried more weight than promises and ownership could not be voted away. The bailiff announced that the hearing was about to begin. Chairs shifted. Conversations faded into silence. Victoria leaned comfortably toward her attorney, as if discussing lunch reservations instead of the future of an entire subdivision. I rested one hand on the old envelope without opening it. My grandfather used to tell me that patience isn't waiting because you're weak. Patience is waiting because you already know exactly when the truth will matter most. In a few minutes, everyone else would finally understand what he meant. I was not born into wealth, and I certainly was not born expecting to spend my life inside courtrooms. I grew up on 48 acres of rolling Texas pasture, where every sunrise carried the smell of cedar, damp soil, and fresh-cut hay drifting through the open windows of my grandfather's farmhouse. My earliest memories were not of vacations or expensive toys. They were of walking fence lines beside my grandfather, Samuel Walker, while he carried a worn leather notebook in one hand and an old brass compass in the other. Every Saturday morning he inspected every corner marker himself, stopping every few hundred feet to brush dirt away from iron survey pins that had been buried decades before I was born. As a little boy, I thought he was simply being stubborn. When I grew older, I realized he was protecting something far more valuable than land. He was protecting certainty. Granddad believed people argued because memories changed, but paper did not. Whenever I asked why he spent so much time checking boundaries that never seemed to move, he would smile beneath the brim of his faded straw hat and say, "A fence can disappear overnight. A deed lasts longer than any fence if you know where to keep it." At the time, those words sounded like another one of his country sayings. Years later, they became the foundation of everything that followed. My father inherited the ranch after Granddad passed away, but he never changed much. We still repaired old gates instead of replacing them. We still measured rainfall in the same rusty coffee can sitting beside the barn. We still drove the same gravel road that curved around a shallow creek before climbing toward the old oak tree overlooking the property. Nothing about our land looked impressive to outsiders. There were no luxury entrances, no stone monuments, no decorative fountains. Just open sky, grazing cattle, weathered fencing, and quiet that could make an entire afternoon feel suspended in time. After my father passed unexpectedly, the property became mine. Friends encouraged me to sell because the suburbs kept expanding farther west every year. Developers mailed offers almost every month. Some arrived on glossy paper with photographs of neighborhoods that looked almost identical to the one now sitting outside that courthouse. Every offer promised an easy future if I simply signed my name. I never did. That ranch carried 3 generations of family history. Every fence post reminded me of someone who had worked before sunrise. Every pecan tree had a story attached to it. Selling never felt like an option. Instead, I accepted a position as a civil engineering consultant specializing in rural infrastructure projects across Texas. My work often kept me away from home for weeks at a time, inspecting bridges, drainage systems, county roads, and flood control improvements. I trusted that my ranch would remain exactly where I had left it because land does not usually disappear while you are gone. At least that is what I believed. The first hint that something was changing arrived in the form of an unfamiliar orange survey flag fluttering beside my western fence after I returned from a 3-week project near Amarillo. It looked harmless enough, barely moving in the warm breeze. I pulled it out without giving it much thought. 2 days later, another appeared. Then another. Soon fresh tire tracks crossed sections of pasture where nobody had driven in years. Standing there beneath the wide Texas sky with the scent of crushed grass rising beneath my boots, I felt something I could not quite explain. It was not fear. It was the quiet certainty that someone else had started making plans for my family's land without ever asking the family that still owned it. The county office sat inside an aging brick building that smelled faintly of old paper, floor polish, and stale coffee. I carried photographs of the orange survey flags tucked inside a folder, expecting someone behind the counter to tell me there had been a simple mistake. Instead, the woman searching the records frowned at her computer screen, clicked through several maps, then looked back at me with polite confusion. According to the newest planning documents, the acreage bordering Willow Creek Highlands was already scheduled for residential expansion. She turned her monitor toward me. Bright colored property lines stretched across the screen, and my western pasture had been shaded the same pale yellow as the neighboring development. My stomach tightened, not because I believed the map, but because I knew someone else clearly did. She apologized and suggested I contact the subdivision management office since they appeared to be coordinating the expansion. That was the first time I heard the name Victoria Holloway. Willow Creek Highlands had recently elected her as president of the Homeowners Association, and around town people described her as organized, ambitious, and remarkably persuasive. They also said she had a talent for making complicated projects happen quickly. 2 days later, I drove through the stone entrance of the subdivision for the first time. Fresh landscaping lined both sides of the boulevard. Sprinklers hissed across newly planted grass, while decorative fountains reflected the afternoon sunlight. Everything looked carefully designed to project success. The clubhouse resembled a luxury lodge more than an office, with polished wood beams, oversized windows, and neatly arranged flower beds. Inside, cool air carried the faint scent of expensive candles and fresh paint. Victoria Holloway greeted me before the receptionist even had a chance to speak. She was exactly as confident as everyone had described. Perfect posture, perfectly styled blonde hair, and the practiced smile of someone who believed every conversation ended in her favor. She welcomed me as though I were another homeowner attending a neighborhood social event instead of someone asking questions about property boundaries. When I explained why I had come, her expression barely changed. She calmly unfolded a colorful development map across the conference table and pointed toward the western edge of the subdivision. According to her, several planning reviews had confirmed that additional residential lots would soon extend beyond the current neighborhood. She spoke with absolute certainty, using phrases like future growth, community investment, and regional development until it almost sounded as though the expansion had become inevitable. I asked one simple question. Had anyone from the Homeowners Association ever contacted me before including my family's ranch in those plans? She paused for only a second before answering that every necessary notification had been handled through the appropriate channels. The answer sounded polished, but it never actually answered my question. As I gathered my folder to leave, Victoria walked with me toward the front entrance. Through the glass windows, we could see survey crews working in the distance beyond the subdivision fence. Their bright safety vests moved slowly across land I had spent my entire childhood exploring. She folded her arms comfortably and smiled toward the activity outside. Progress always feels uncomfortable at first, Mr. Walker, she said in a voice so calm it almost sounded reassuring. Eventually, everyone realizes it benefits the whole community. I looked past the workers toward the old oak tree standing alone against the Texas sky. It had survived droughts, storms, and 3 generations of my family. Somehow seeing strangers measuring around it unsettled me more than any conversation inside that office. Driving home, the gravel road sounded different beneath my tires, not because it had changed, but because I finally understood that someone with influence had already decided my land belonged to their future instead of my family's past. Within 3 weeks, the survey flags had multiplied into wooden stakes, then heavy equipment, then long strings of orange construction fencing stretching across ground that had never belonged to anyone but my family. The mornings no longer began with birdsong drifting across open pasture. They began with the steady rumble of diesel engines, the sharp beeping of reversing loaders, and the smell of fresh earth rolling across the hills. Every afternoon, another piece of familiar landscape disappeared beneath layers of gravel. The old cattle trail where my father had taught me to drive a pickup became a temporary access road. The shallow creek crossing where my grandfather once repaired fence posts filled with construction trucks carrying concrete and lumber. Neighbors stopped calling it the Walker Ranch. They started referring to it as the west phase of Willow Creek Highlands. Hearing those words felt stranger than I could explain. It was as though people believed repeating something often enough could change ownership itself. I contacted the county planning office again and asked whether active construction should continue while boundary questions remained unresolved. The answer came wrapped in careful language. According to the permits currently on file, no stop order had been issued. If I believed the records were incorrect, I could pursue the matter through the appropriate legal channels. That sounded simple until I learned how slowly those channels actually moved. By the time appointments were scheduled and preliminary reviews were assigned, grading crews had already reshaped acres of pasture. Friends urged me to confront the workers directly, but they were simply following approved plans placed in front of them. They were not the ones making decisions. One afternoon, I drove out to the property line, carrying copies of my older survey maps. A site supervisor stepped away from a bulldozer, wiped dust from his safety glasses, and politely explained that his company had been hired under fully approved development documents. He even showed me laminated site plans identifying future streets, parks, and residential lots extending across ground where my family's fences had stood for decades. He was courteous, professional, and completely convinced he was standing on land that legally belonged to the project. Before leaving, I noticed something that stayed with me. Bright red signs had already been installed near the temporary entrance announcing reservations for new homes. Families walked through model floor plans while children pointed excitedly toward lots that had not even been finished yet. Sales representatives handed out brochures beside tables covered with coffee and pastries. The atmosphere felt more like a weekend festival than an active construction site. Victoria arrived in a white sport utility vehicle just as I was walking back toward my truck. She greeted several prospective buyers by name before turning toward me with the same composed smile I had seen at the clubhouse. She asked whether I had come to see the community taking shape. I answered that I had come to see my family's land. For the first time, her smile became almost sympathetic. She said these kinds of misunderstandings happened whenever older properties bordered expanding suburbs and assured me that professionals had already verified everything. Then she wished me a pleasant afternoon and continued greeting future homeowners as though our conversation had been nothing more than a brief interruption. I drove away without another word. People watching from a distance probably assumed I had accepted defeat. What they could not see was that every new foundation poured onto that land quietly increased the stakes. The more complete the neighborhood became, the more carefully every decision would eventually be examined. I had begun to understand something my grandfather tried to teach me years earlier. Sometimes the loudest move you can make is choosing not to interrupt someone while they confidently build their own mistake. I hired a property attorney expecting confidence and clarity. Instead, he spent less than 20 minutes studying copies of my older surveys before leaning back in his chair with a tired expression that told me everything long before he spoke. He explained that once large developments reached advanced stages, untangling ownership disputes became extraordinarily complicated. Buyers entered contracts, lenders financed mortgages, contractors completed work, and insurance companies became involved. Even if mistakes existed somewhere in the paperwork, proving them could take years. His recommendation surprised me more than anything else. He suggested negotiating compensation instead of fighting for the land itself. I thanked him for his time, gathered my documents, and quietly walked out. The hallway outside his office smelled of fresh carpet and printer toner, but all I could think about was my grandfather laughing at the idea of bargaining away land simply because someone else had already started building on it. Over the following months, I visited county archives, title companies, survey offices, and engineering departments. Every place had another form to complete, another appointment to schedule, another explanation for why the process would take longer than expected. Meanwhile, construction never slowed. Streets received names. Sidewalks appeared. Decorative. Streetlights illuminated roads that had once been open pasture. The old oak tree still stood, but now it overlooked rows of rooftops instead of grazing cattle. Some evenings I parked on a public road overlooking the subdivision and watched moving trucks arrive. Families unloaded bicycles, patio furniture, flower pots, and welcome mats. Children laughed while chasing one another across freshly planted lawns. None of them looked like villains. They looked like people beginning a new chapter of their lives. That made everything more complicated emotionally, but it changed nothing legally. More than once I asked myself whether I should seek an emergency injunction to stop additional construction. Every answer brought me back to the same uncomfortable conclusion. If the records everyone relied upon truly contained a serious mistake, then rushing into court too early would only create arguments before every fact had been uncovered. Waiting felt unbearable, but acting before I understood everything felt even more dangerous. Around town, my silence became its own story. Some neighbors assumed I had accepted a settlement. Others claimed I had discovered my paperwork was flawed and simply refused to admit defeat. At the grocery store, I overheard two men discussing how the Walker Ranch had finally become valuable after all these years because someone smarter had developed it properly. I reached for a carton of milk, paid for my groceries, and never corrected them. Victoria continued appearing in local newspaper photographs beside ribbon cuttings and community events. Every article praised the rapid success of Willow Creek Highlands. Sales exceeded expectations. Additional phases were announced. Real estate agents described the neighborhood as one of the fastest-growing communities in the county. Every headline seemed to erase another piece of my family's history. Yet beneath that growing success, one detail continued bothering me. During every title search I requested, copies looked newer than they should have. Certain records referenced older documents that no employee could immediately produce. Dates lined up, but the chain connecting them felt strangely incomplete, like missing pages had quietly disappeared from the middle of a book. I could not prove anything yet, only that something about the official story refused to fit together. Most people mistook my silence for surrender because silence is easy to misunderstand. They believed I had stopped searching. The truth was much quieter than that. I had simply reached the point where asking different questions mattered more than raising my voice. And somewhere behind decades of paperwork, I was beginning to suspect the answer had never been lost at all. The breakthrough did not happen inside a courthouse or a government office. It happened on a rainy Saturday afternoon inside my grandfather's old farmhouse, while I was cleaning out a storage room I had avoided since my father's funeral. The steady rhythm of rain tapping against the tin roof mixed with the familiar scent of aged cedar, dust, and machine oil. Every shelf held another piece of family history, from rusted branding irons to faded photographs and handwritten notebooks tied together with string. Near the back wall stood the same heavy oak cabinet my grandfather had always kept locked. I remembered asking him about it as a child, and he would simply smile and say, "Some papers are too important to leave where everyone expects to find them." After several minutes of searching through drawers, I found a small brass key taped beneath the bottom shelf exactly where only someone who knew his habits would ever look. The cabinet door opened with a slow creak. Inside sat several neatly labeled boxes, all protected inside waterproof sleeves despite their age. One box carried a handwritten label in my grandfather's unmistakable script, "Property Originals." My pulse quickened before I even lifted the lid. The first documents were familiar tax records and family correspondence, but underneath them rested something wrapped inside a weathered manila envelope that looked almost identical to the one now sitting beside me in the courtroom. Carefully unfolding the papers, I found the original recorded deed transferring the ranch into my grandfather's ownership decades earlier, complete with embossed county seals that had never faded. Behind it lay every recorded transfer through my family's history without a single missing link. Even more surprising was a professionally stamped boundary survey prepared nearly 50 years earlier by a licensed surveyor whose handwritten field notes remained attached. Unlike the simplified digital maps I had been shown in recent months, this survey identified permanent stone monuments, creek references, and precise measurements extending far beyond the current subdivision fence. Tucked behind the survey was another folder containing correspondence between my grandfather and the county during an earlier mapping project. One letter immediately caught my attention. It referenced a proposed map revision that had been rejected because shifting one property line would create future ownership conflicts if the original deed descriptions were ever ignored. I read that sentence 3 times. Suddenly, every strange inconsistency I had encountered during my searches began fitting together. Somewhere over the years, newer mapping records appeared to rely on an updated reference, while the original chain of title had never actually changed. The official digital records everyone trusted seemed to have drifted away from the controlling documents stored safely inside this cabinet. I did not celebrate. I did not call Victoria. I did not rush to the construction site waving paperwork in the air. Instead, I spent the next several weeks quietly hiring an independent title historian, a licensed surveyor, and a property law specialist. One by one, each expert reviewed the originals without knowing what the others had concluded. Their reactions were remarkably similar. Long periods of silence followed by careful questions, then increasingly detailed requests for additional records. None of them promised victory, but all of them agreed on one critical point. The original deed had never been extinguished, replaced, or legally surrendered. If the supporting evidence held together under judicial review, the true boundary would be determined by these original recorded instruments rather than assumptions built from later mapping errors. I gently returned every document to its protective sleeves, except for the old manila envelope. That one stayed with me. My grandfather had been right all along. Fences could disappear, maps could change, computers could display the wrong lines. But the right piece of paper, preserved through generations and presented at exactly the right moment, could still change everything. Once the experts finished reviewing every original record, I finally understood why my grandfather valued patience more than anger. The documents were powerful, but only if they appeared at the right time and in the right place. My attorney explained that marching into the subdivision waving copies would accomplish very little. The homeowners association would dismiss them, the developer would question them, and everyone involved would simply continue relying on the same modern records that had created the confusion in the first place. If we wanted the originals to carry their full legal weight, they needed to be introduced through the court with every supporting opinion already prepared. That meant one thing: we would wait. It sounded almost impossible after everything I had watched happen, yet it was exactly what we did. Weeks became months. Then months became more than a year. Willow Creek Highlands continued expanding exactly as planned. New families moved into completed homes every weekend. Landscapers planted young oak trees along sidewalks that had once crossed open pasture. Delivery trucks came and went from dawn until dusk. Children played basketball in freshly paved driveways while neighbors gathered around community mailboxes discussing school schedules and weekend barbecues. Life moved forward for everyone except me. From the outside, it looked as though I had disappeared from the story entirely. Victoria Holloway certainly believed that. Her confidence grew with every successful phase of construction. Local newspapers featured photographs of award ceremonies recognizing the neighborhood's rapid growth. She spoke proudly about responsible planning, strong leadership, and building a lasting community for future generations. Each interview made her appear more certain that history had already chosen its winner. Occasionally we crossed paths at public meetings or local events. She always greeted me politely, almost kindly, as though she felt sorry that I had been unable to accept change. I returned the courtesy every single time. Calm people make others underestimate them. That became my greatest advantage. Behind the scenes, however, our preparation never stopped. The independent surveyor revisited every original monument identified in the decades-old field notes. Some remained exactly where the original survey described them. The title historian reconstructed the complete ownership chain from the earliest recorded transfers through the present day. My attorney carefully organized every exhibit into a timeline showing where later mapping assumptions had gradually drifted away from the controlling deed descriptions without ever changing legal ownership itself. Every opinion was verified twice. Every measurement was reviewed again. Every page received another careful examination. There would be no surprises once the case reached court because we intended to remove every possible question before anyone else even thought to ask it. Friends occasionally wondered why I had not requested emergency relief months earlier. I always answered the same way. A half-finished subdivision invites arguments about possibilities. A completed neighborhood creates facts that cannot be ignored. Every additional home, every recorded sale, every mortgage, every public improvement made one issue increasingly important. Who actually owned the ground beneath it all? That question only became larger as time passed. By the time our complaint was formally filed, Willow Creek Highlands had become one of the county's proudest developments. News of the lawsuit spread quickly, but most people dismissed it as one final protest from a landowner who refused to let go of the past. Even Victoria appeared relaxed when the hearing date was announced. She arrived surrounded by experienced attorneys, engineering consultants, and stacks of polished reports. I arrived carrying one weathered manila envelope that had survived 3 generations inside my grandfather's cabinet. Looking at it, nobody in that courtroom could have guessed they were about to discover that sometimes the smallest piece of evidence is the one history has been waiting for all along. The hearing began exactly the way Victoria expected it would. Her attorney spoke first, projecting polished maps onto large courtroom screens while explaining the development timeline in confident, measured voices. They displayed permits, planning approvals, engineering reports, recorded plats, financing documents, and photographs showing the transformation of open pasture into one of the county's fastest-growing communities. Every exhibit reinforced the same message. The neighborhood had been built legally, sold responsibly, and supported by official records relied upon by countless professionals. Several experts testified that they had completed their work according to the information available at the time. None of them appeared dishonest. They simply trusted the documents placed before them. Victoria watched each presentation with quiet satisfaction, occasionally exchanging brief smiles with members of her legal team. Looking across the courtroom, she probably saw exactly what everyone else saw. One homeowner sitting quietly with a single weathered envelope, while an entire team of attorneys presented months of preparation. My attorney never interrupted. He took notes, thanked each witness politely, and waited. Hours passed before the judge finally turned toward our table and asked whether we wished to present our case. My attorney stood, nodded respectfully, and called only 3 witnesses. The independent title historian testified first. Instead of criticizing the modern records, he carefully explained the legal importance of maintaining an uninterrupted chain of title and why original recorded instruments remain controlling unless they are lawfully replaced. Next came the licensed surveyor, who described locating permanent boundary monuments referenced in field notes prepared decades earlier. He presented photographs showing that several original markers still existed exactly where the historical survey placed them. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Then my attorney looked at me and simply said, "Mr. Walker." I carried the old manila envelope to the witness stand, opened it carefully, and removed the original deed my grandfather had preserved all those years. Even before anyone spoke, the atmosphere inside the courtroom changed. The embossed county seal caught the afternoon light as the document was handed to the judge. One page became another, then another. Original surveys, recorded transfers, correspondence documenting the rejected boundary revision. Every document fit together like pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting decades to be assembled. Victoria's attorney requested permission to examine the originals. His confidence faded as he compared the controlling legal descriptions against the modern mapping records displayed earlier that morning. He asked for additional time. The judge granted a brief recess. During those 20 minutes, conversations filled every corner of the courthouse hallway. Engineers studied copies of survey notes. Title specialists compared legal descriptions line by line. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued dramatically. They simply kept discovering that every original document pointed to the same conclusion. When court resumed, the judge asked several direct questions about the discrepancy between the historical chain of title and the later mapping assumptions. The answers became increasingly careful. No witness claimed the original deed was invalid. No witness claimed ownership had ever been legally transferred away from my family. The issue was no longer whether the neighborhood existed. Everyone could see that it did. The question had become whether the land beneath those streets and homes had ever legally stopped belonging to the Walker family. The silence after that question seemed louder than every construction machine I had heard over the previous 2 years. Victoria slowly looked toward me for the first time without the confidence she had carried since the day we met in her clubhouse. My grandfather's envelope rested on the evidence table exactly where it belonged. It had outlasted fences, maps, computers, assumptions, and nearly every certainty built around it. And now the courtroom was finally seeing what he had always believed. The truth did not need to arrive first. It only needed to arrive complete. The judge did not deliver a dramatic speech. He simply spent nearly an hour reviewing the evidence one final time before returning to the bench with a written decision that felt almost understated compared to everything leading up to it. He explained that the court was not deciding whether Willow Creek Highlands was a successful neighborhood or whether the people living there had acted in good faith. The court was deciding ownership, and ownership began with the controlling chain of title supported by the original recorded deed and the accompanying historical surveys. The later mapping records, while relied upon by many people, could not erase documents that had never been legally replaced or transferred. With those words, years of assumptions quietly collapsed under the weight of a few carefully preserved pages. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated inside the courtroom. The only sound was the soft turning of paper as attorneys immediately began reviewing the ruling. Victoria Holloway remained seated longer than anyone else. For the first time since I had met her, she seemed less like the confident leader of a growing community and more like someone realizing that certainty and correctness are not always the same thing. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered beneath the warm Texas sun while lawyers from several companies hurried between parked vehicles, making urgent telephone calls. Developers began negotiating solutions. Title insurers launched their own reviews. Financial institutions examined the records supporting hundreds of transactions. The process that followed was long, professional, and far less dramatic than people often imagine. Agreements were negotiated, ownership issues were addressed through legal channels, and every affected party worked through the consequences according to the law. Families who had purchased homes in good faith were treated with respect throughout the process because they had trusted the same records everyone else had relied upon. My dispute had never been with them. It had always been about making sure the truth finally reached the place where it mattered. Several months later, I drove slowly along the same roads that had once crossed my family's pasture. Young trees had grown taller. Children still rode bicycles along the sidewalks. The neighborhood remained full of ordinary people building ordinary lives. Looking across the landscape, I realized something that surprised even me. Winning had never been about watching someone else lose. It was about proving that patience, preparation, and respect for the law still mattered in a world that often rewarded speed over accuracy. Before leaving, I stopped beside the old oak tree that had overlooked our ranch long before any subdivision existed. Its branches stretched across the afternoon sky exactly as they had throughout my childhood. I placed one hand against its rough bark and thought about my grandfather walking these same fields with his leather notebook and brass compass, checking boundary markers that seemed unimportant to everyone except him. He had never expected future generations to memorize every legal description. He had simply expected us to protect what was true until the day someone finally needed it. Back at the farmhouse, I opened the oak cabinet one last time and returned the weathered manila envelope to the same shelf where my grandfather had hidden it years before. The brass key clicked softly as I locked the cabinet again. Nothing about that sound was loud, yet somehow it carried more meaning than every bulldozer, every meeting, every ribbon cutting, and every confident promise I had heard over the previous 2 years. Some people believe justice arrives with applause. In my experience, justice often arrives much more quietly than that. It waits inside forgotten cabinets, survives inside old paper, and speaks only when every fact is finally in its proper place. My grandfather was right all along. Patience is not the absence of action. It is the discipline to let the truth arrive exactly when it cannot be ignored.